and enjoying every moment with your family and loved ones. Today, we're about to discover whether Jack and Tu Tien are finally receiving the miracle they've been waiting for. Could a visit to the hospital change their lives forever? Or is there another unexpected twist waiting for them? Stay with us to find out. And if you enjoy heartwarming stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our upcoming videos. Then there was something else she had quietly mentioned the previous evening. She had missed her period. It was only a few days late, but for Jack, that tiny detail carried enormous weight. He didn't dare get his hopes up too much. After all, they had dreamed about starting a family before, and he knew how painful disappointment could be. Still, no matter how hard he tried to stay realistic, his imagination kept wandering. What if this was finally happening? What if, after all this time, they were about to become parents? By the time the sun rose, Jack had already made up his mind. Instead of heading to the office, he called his assistant and postponed every meeting scheduled for the day. His company could wait. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. He wanted to know the truth. When Tu Tien walked out of their room, she was surprised to see Jack already dressed and waiting by the front door with the car keys in his hand. "You're leaving this early?" she asked. Jack smiled gently. "We're going to the county hospital." She looked at him with uncertainty. "I really think it's probably nothing. I've just been working too hard lately. Maybe I'm exhausted." Jack stepped closer and held her hand. "Maybe you're right." He paused before continuing. "But maybe you're not. No matter what the result is, I'd rather know the truth than keep guessing. And if something really is happening, I want to take care of you the right way." His calm voice made it impossible for her to argue. She nodded softly. "Okay." The drive to the hospital felt much longer than usual. Neither of them talked very much. Outside the window, the morning traffic slowly came to life while the countryside passed quietly by. Inside the car, however, their minds were racing. Tu Tien couldn't stop thinking about every symptom she'd experienced over the past week. Was it really possible, or was she simply imagining connections that weren't there? She didn't want Jack to get his hopes up, only to be disappointed later. Jack, on the other hand, kept stealing quick glances toward his wife. "Are you feeling okay? Do you need some water? Should we pull over for a few minutes?" After hearing the same questions several times, Tu Tien couldn't help laughing. "You've asked me that 3 times already." Jack smiled awkwardly. "I know. I'm just worried." She gently squeezed his arm. "I'm fine." Nearly 40 minutes later, they arrived at the county hospital. The outpatient department was already busy. Elderly patients waited patiently for routine checkups. Parents carried young children through the hallways. Several young couples sat quietly outside the obstetrics department, each wearing a different expression. Some looked nervous, others excited, while a few simply stared at the floor in silence. Jack and Tu Tien registered at the front desk before being called into the examination room. The doctor carefully listened as Tu Tien described everything she had experienced over the last several days. Morning nausea, sensitivity to smells, unusual fatigue, a stronger appetite, and finally, her delayed menstrual cycle. The doctor nodded thoughtfully while making notes. These symptoms could point to several different possibilities, the doctor explained calmly. Since it's still very early, we can't draw any conclusions today. I'd like to order a blood test along with an ultrasound examination. Once we receive the results, we'll have a much clearer picture. Jack answered immediately. Of course. Whatever needs to be done. Within minutes, Tu Tien had her blood drawn before being escorted to the ultrasound room. The examination itself didn't take very long. Because it was still an extremely early stage, if there was a pregnancy at all, the doctor explained that it might be impossible to see anything clearly on the screen. Afterward, they were asked to wait outside while the laboratory completed the blood analysis. Those next few minutes felt like hours. Jack and Tu Tien sat quietly beside one another without saying much. Across the hallway, a young father was carrying a little girl who couldn't have been more than a year old. She laughed happily every time he lifted her into the air. The father smiled with pure joy, completely focused on making his daughter laugh again. Jack watched them silently. Without realizing it, he began imagining himself in that exact position someday, holding his own child, learning how to change diapers, staying awake through sleepless nights, listening for a tiny voice calling him Dad for the very first time. Everything he had once considered difficult suddenly seemed worth every sacrifice. Beside him, Tu Tien noticed the look in his eyes. Without saying a word, she reached over and gently took his hand. Jack looked at her, smiled softly, and squeezed her fingers. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Several more minutes passed before the nurse finally called Tu Tien's name. Jack stood up so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. Without saying a word, he instinctively reached for Tu Tien's hand, and together they walked back into the doctor's office. The doctor glanced at the report one more time before looking up with a reassuring smile. The blood test has come back. Both of them unconsciously held their breath. The results suggest that there is a strong possibility you're in the very early stages of pregnancy. For a brief moment, the room fell completely silent. Jack stared at the doctor, almost as if he hadn't heard correctly. Really? The doctor nodded. Yes. However, because it is still extremely early, the embryo is too small to be clearly identified on today's ultrasound. At this point, we cannot make a final confirmation based on imaging alone. I'd like both of you to come back in several days for another examination. By then, we should be able to obtain a much clearer result. Jack's eyes immediately became misty. He had imagined hearing those words countless times before, but now that they were finally spoken aloud, he found himself unable to respond. Instead, he simply turned toward Tu Tien. She looked equally overwhelmed. There was still uncertainty. There was still another examination waiting ahead. But for the first time in a very long while, hope had replaced fear. Tu Tien slowly lowered her eyes toward her stomach. Almost instinctively, she rested a gentle hand against it. A tiny smile appeared on her face. So, there's really a chance? The doctor smiled warmly. There certainly is. Just remember not to overwork yourself over the next several days. Get plenty of rest. Eat nutritious meals. Avoid unnecessary stress. And most importantly, come back for your follow-up appointment. Jack nodded repeatedly. We will. Thank you, Doctor. As they walked out of the consultation room, neither of them spoke for several moments. The hospital hallway somehow looked different now. Nothing around them had changed, yet everything seemed brighter. Once they reached the parking lot, Jack suddenly stopped walking. I'll be right back." Before Tu Tien could even ask where he was going, Jack hurried across the street toward a nearby convenience store. A few minutes later, he returned carrying 2 large shopping bags. Tu Tien blinked in surprise. "What did you buy?" Jack scratched the back of his head awkwardly. "I wasn't really sure, so I bought a little bit of everything." Inside the bags were prenatal milk, fresh fruit, vitamin supplements, bottled juice, healthy snacks, and several loose-fitting outfits that looked much more comfortable than the clothes Tu Tien usually wore. She couldn't stop laughing. "You've already started shopping?" Jack smiled sheepishly. "What if the doctor is right? I don't want to waste another day. If you're really pregnant, I want both of you to have everything you need." His words instantly softened her heart. "You don't even know for certain yet?" "I know." He smiled. "But preparing early can't hurt." On the drive home, Jack drove even more carefully than before. Every speed bump was taken slowly. Every sharp turn became gentle. Even when another vehicle tried to overtake them, he simply slowed down and let it pass. Tu Tien finally laughed again. "You've never driven this carefully before." Jack glanced at her with a grin. "Well, I might be carrying the 2 most important people in my life." She playfully rolled her eyes. "You're getting ahead of yourself." "Maybe, but I don't mind." After arriving home, Jack insisted that Tu Tien rest while he unpacked everything himself. He carefully arranged the fruit in the kitchen. The vitamins were placed neatly on the dining table. The new clothes were folded and carried into their bedroom. Watching him move around the house with so much excitement made Tu Tien smile to herself. She had never seen this side of him before. Normally, Jack was calm, logical, and completely focused on work. Today, however, he seemed like an excited child who had just received the happiest news of his life. That evening, after dinner, the house became quiet again. Tu Tien sat alone near the bedroom window. Almost without thinking, she rested both hands gently over her abdomen. No one knew for certain what the next examination would reveal. Perhaps this tiny hope would become reality. Perhaps they would still have to wait a little longer. Either way, she realized something had already changed inside her heart. Meanwhile, Jack was sitting in the living room with his laptop open. One search led to another. How to care for someone during the first month of pregnancy. Foods that are good for expecting mothers. Activities to avoid during early pregnancy. How fathers can support their wives. He read every article carefully, making mental notes as if he were preparing for the most important responsibility of his life. He didn't notice Tu Tien quietly standing in the doorway, watching him with a warm smile. She didn't interrupt him. Instead, she simply admired the man she had married. A husband who was already trying his best, long before he even knew for certain whether he was going to become a father. The night grew quieter. Jack closed his laptop and looked toward the bedroom. Tu Tien was already asleep, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach. He smiled softly before whispering to himself, "If this miracle is real, I promise I'll protect both of you with everything I have." And as the light slowly faded to black, one question remained. After noticing Tu Tien's unusual symptoms, Jack becomes deeply worried that something important may be happening. She has been sensitive to smells, feeling nauseous in the morning, eating more than usual, and has missed her period. Unable to sleep, Jack decides to put work aside and take her to the county hospital for a checkup. Although Tu Tien tries to convince him it may only be exhaustion, Jack insists on knowing the truth. so he can care for her properly. At the hospital, the doctor orders blood tests and an ultrasound. While waiting, Jack watches other parents with their children and begins imagining himself as a father. The doctor later reveals that Tu Tien may be in the very early stages of pregnancy, filling both of them with hope, emotion, and uncertainty.